Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest story. Sometimes the woman everyone overlooks holds secrets that could shake the very ground they stand on. This is about Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old librarian who walked into Blackwater Tactical Range on a Tuesday morning, carrying nothing but a worn gym bag and 20 years of buried memories. What happened next would become legend among shooting enthusiasts, shared in hushed conversations across gun ranges from Texas to Montana. It's a story about respect, redemption, and the dangerous assumption that quiet means weak. It's about how a single bullet can shatter more than just a target. It can destroy years of carefully constructed lies and reveal truths that some people spend their entire lives trying to hide. This isn't just another underdog story. This is about the moment when silence became the most powerful weapon in the room, and one woman's past collided with her present in the most unexpected way possible. By the time you finish reading, you'll understand why the men who laughed at Sarah that morning have never forgotten the sound of her first shot, and why some of them still wake up in cold sweats, remembering the look in her eyes when she finally spoke. The morning fog was still hanging over the Blackwater Tactical Range when Sarah Chen's Honda Civic pulled into the gravel parking lot. The sound of her car door closing seemed unnaturally loud in the early quiet, mixing with the distant pop, pop, pop of gunfire from the active ranges. She stood for a moment, adjusting the strap of her worn canvas gym bag, watching the building that had haunted her thoughts for 3 months. Blackwater wasn't just any shooting range. It was the kind of place where serious shooters came to test their skills, where local law enforcement trained, and where weekend warriors came to prove their masculinity. The building itself looked like a fortress: concrete walls, small windows, and a sign that read, "Professionals Only," in bold red letters. Sarah had driven past it dozens of times on her way to the library where she worked, always slowing down, always wondering, always remembering. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical wheeze, and Sarah stepped into a world that felt completely foreign, yet strangely familiar. The smell hit her first: gun oil, cordite, and the peculiar metallic scent that comes from thousands of rounds fired in an enclosed space. Behind the counter, a heavy-set man with arms covered in military tattoos looked up from a gun magazine. His name tag read Rick, and his expression immediately shifted from professional indifference to barely concealed amusement. "Can I help you, miss?" Rick asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a lost tourist. His eyes took in Sarah's appearance, her oversized cardigan, sensible flats, and the way she clutched her gym bag like a security blanket. To him, she looked exactly like what she was supposed to look like: a quiet librarian who had probably never held anything more dangerous than a stapler. "I'd like to rent some range time," Sarah said softly, her voice almost lost in the ambient noise of the building, "and maybe rent a pistol." Rick's grin widened, and Sarah caught him exchanging a look with another employee who had emerged from the back room. The second man, whose shirt identified him as Dale, was younger, but carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd spent too much time around firearms and not enough time around people who might challenge him. "Sure thing, sweetheart," Rick said, leaning forward on the counter. "What kind of shooting experience do you have? Ever handled a firearm before?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's fingers tightened on her bag strap, and for just a moment something flickered behind her eyes, something that might have been recognition or memory or pain. But it passed so quickly that neither Rick nor Dale noticed. "Some," she answered simply. "Some," Rick repeated, chuckling. "Well, that's honest at least. Tell you what, we've got a nice little .22 that would be perfect for a beginner. Very gentle recoil, not too scary. Dale here can show you how to load it, basic safety, that sort of thing." Dale stepped forward, clearly enjoying his role as the expert. "Yeah, no problem. We get a lot of first-timers in here. Nothing to be embarrassed about. Everyone starts somewhere, right? As Rick processed her paperwork, Sarah became aware of the other customers in the pro shop. 3 men in their 30s had been examining ammunition when she walked in, but now their attention was clearly divided between the boxes of bullets and the entertainment value of watching a nervous librarian navigate a gun range. They weren't being subtle about it. The tallest of the 3, a man with a perfectly groomed beard and expensive tactical gear, nudged his companions. $20 says she doesn't make it through a full magazine without jumping, he whispered, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. His friends chuckled. The second man, stockier and wearing a t-shirt that proclaimed Molon Labe in aggressive font, shook his head. I'm not taking that bet, Marcus. Look at her. She's already shaking and she hasn't even seen a gun yet. The third man, who wore the kind of wraparound sunglasses that belonged outdoors, was more direct. This is what happens when soccer moms watch too many action movies. Next thing you know, she'll be asking if they have guns that shoot blanks. Sarah heard every word. She had developed excellent hearing during 23 years of life, especially the 14 years she had spent in environments where missing the wrong sound could mean the difference between safety and disaster. But she gave no sign that their comments affected her. Instead, she focused on filling out the range waiver, her handwriting neat and precise despite the tremor in her hands that everyone assumed was nervousness. Rick slid a clipboard across the counter. Just need your signature here, here, and initial there. Standard liability stuff, and I'll need to see some ID. Sarah's driver's license showed a woman with longer hair and 20 pounds more weight, taken during a time when she'd been trying very hard to disappear into herself. Rick glanced at it without really looking, the way people do when they've processed thousands of similar documents. All right, Ms. Chen. Range fee is $25 for the hour, gun rental is $15, and you'll need to buy our ammunition. Can't bring your own unless you're a member. That'll be another $20 for a box of 50 rounds. As Sarah counted out cash, who paid cash anymore? Dale gathered the equipment she'd need. The .22 pistol he selected was indeed perfect for beginners. A Ruger Mark IV with adjustable sights and a reputation for reliability. He also grabbed safety glasses, ear protection, and a paper target featuring the standard bullseye design. Range rules are simple, Dale explained as he led Sarah toward the shooting lanes. Keep your weapon pointed downrange at all times. No rapid fire. This isn't an action movie. When the range goes hot, nobody goes forward of this line. When it goes cold, everybody puts their guns down and steps back. Got it? Sarah nodded, following him through a heavy door marked Range Access, Eye and Ear Protection Required. The sound that greeted them was like stepping into a war zone. The sharp crack of pistols, the deeper boom of rifles, and the occasional explosion of a large-caliber handgun. The concrete walls seemed to absorb and amplify the noise simultaneously. Lane 7 was at the far end of the range, and Dale set up Sarah's equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this demonstration hundreds of times. The 3 men from the pro shop had followed them in and taken lanes 3, 4, and 5, close enough to watch the show they expected to unfold. Okay, basic grip, Dale said, raising his voice over the gunfire. Dominant hand high on the grip, support hand wrapped around like this, both thumbs forward. Keep your stance balanced, lean slightly forward. The gun's going to jump when you shoot. That's normal. Sarah took the pistol in her hands, and for just a moment, Dale caught something in her expression that made him pause. The way she handled the weapon wasn't quite right for a complete beginner. There was too much familiarity in the way her fingers found the grip, too much muscle memory in how she automatically checked the weight and balance. But the moment passed, and Dale decided he'd been imagining things. After all, he was looking at a woman who worked in a library, wore cardigans, and had probably learned everything she knew about guns from watching Netflix. The safety's here, he continued, showing her the mechanism. Red means dead, When you can see the red dot, the gun is ready to fire. Sight picture is simple. Line up the front sight with the rear sight, put that on your target, and squeeze the trigger straight back. Don't jerk it, just steady pressure. Sarah nodded along to his instruction, asking the occasional question that seemed appropriately naive. She inquired about proper breathing technique, about how to know when the gun was empty, about what to do if it jammed. All perfectly reasonable questions from someone learning to shoot. Meanwhile, the commentary from lanes 3, 4, and 5 was getting louder and more obnoxious. Marcus, the bearded man with expensive gear, had started his shooting session with a display that was clearly designed to intimidate. His .45 ACP barked like thunder, and he was shooting with the kind of aggressive precision that announced his experience to anyone watching. "Hope nobody's keeping score," he called out during a ceasefire. "This might not be fair to the beginners." His target, set at 25 yards, showed a tight grouping in the center ring. It was genuinely impressive shooting, and Marcus made sure everyone noticed by holding up his target as he brought it forward to examine. 20 years of practice, he announced to nobody in particular. "Started when I was 12. Some people have it, some people don't." The stocky man in the Milan Labe shirt, whose name was apparently Kevin, was having similar success with his 9mm Glock. "Military training helps," he added, though anyone who'd actually served would have recognized immediately that Kevin's knowledge came from YouTube videos and gun magazines rather than actual military service. The third man, Tony, was struggling more with his revolver but compensating with volume. "Just wait until I break out the .357, he bragged. "That'll wake up the whole range." Dale finished his instruction and stepped back. "Whenever you're ready, just remember everything I told you. Start close. 7 yards is fine for your first shots. Take your time, there's no rush." Sarah positioned herself at the firing line, raising the pistol in a proper Weaver stance. Her breathing had steadied, and the tremor in her hands had mysteriously disappeared. She looked down the sights at the target hanging 7 yards away, a distance that, to experienced shooters, might as well be point-blank range. The range went hot. Around her, the familiar symphony of gunfire resumed. Marcus and Kevin continued their showing off, while Tony worked his way through a cylinder of 38 special rounds. And Sarah stood quietly at lane 7, taking her time, breathing steadily, looking like exactly what everyone expected her to look like. What nobody noticed, what nobody could have noticed unless they knew what to look for, was the way Sarah's stance had shifted slightly, how her grip had adjusted to something more efficient than what Dale had shown her, how her breathing pattern had changed to something deeper and more controlled, how her eyes had narrowed slightly behind the safety glasses, taking in not just the target but everything around it. 23 years of carefully constructed normalcy had brought Sarah to this moment. 23 years of pretending to be someone she wasn't, of hiding skills that most people couldn't imagine a librarian possessing, of carrying secrets that would have changed how everyone in her life looked at her. But secrets have a way of demanding recognition, and some skills once learned never really fade. Sarah aligned her sights, controlled her breathing, and prepared to fire the shot that would change everything in her carefully controlled world. The shot that would strip away years of pretense and reveal exactly who Sarah Chen really was underneath her cardigan and sensible shoes. The shot that would silence the laughter and replace it with something else entirely. The gun was steady in her hands. The target was clear in her sights. And for the first time in over 2 decades, Sarah Chen was about to be herself. The moment before Sarah pulled the trigger lasted forever, and no time at all. In that suspended instant, she could hear everything with crystal clarity. Kevin's boastful commentary about his latest group, Marcus adjusting his expensive tactical vest with unnecessary flourish, Tony fumbling with his revolver cylinder. She could hear Dale shuffling his feet behind her, probably betting internally on whether she'd hit the target at all. Most of all, she could hear the voice in her head. the one that had kept her safe for 23 years, by reminding her to be small, quiet, invisible. The voice that whispered urgent warnings about exposure, about the carefully constructed life she'd built crumbling if anyone discovered what she really was. But there was another voice, too, one that had been silent for too long. The voice that remembered muscle memory carved into bone through endless repetition. The voice that recalled a different life. Different skills, different versions of herself that existed before Sarah Chen, the librarian, had been born. She squeezed the trigger. The .22 caliber round traveled the 7 yards to the target in roughly 0.0003 seconds. In that same span of time, several things happened that would reshape the next hour of Sarah's life. The gun cycled smoothly, ejecting the spent brass in a perfect arc. The muzzle flash, barely visible in the range's bright lighting, lasted exactly 0.04 seconds, and 147 grains of lead traveling at 1,200 feet per second punched a hole in the exact center of the bullseye. Not close to the center, not pretty good for a beginner, dead center, perfect center, the kind of center that takes years of practice to achieve consistently. The first sign that something unusual had happened was the sudden silence from Lane 5. Tony had been in the middle of explaining to Marcus why .357 Magnum was superior to 9mm when something in his peripheral vision made him stop mid-sentence. He lowered his revolver and turned to look at Sarah's target, squinting to make sure he was seeing correctly. He said, his voice cutting through the range noise. Marcus, Kevin, look at lane 7. Marcus finished his shot before turning, his expression already primed with condescending amusement. He was prepared to offer patronizing encouragement about Sarah's good try or decent first attempt. Instead, his words died in his throat as his eyes found her target. Kevin lowered his Glock and followed their gaze. "No way," he muttered. "Beginner's luck. Has to be." But Dale, standing directly behind Sarah, had the best view of what had just happened. He'd watched thousands of first-time shooters take their initial shots. He'd seen the flinching, the wild misses, the surprise and delight when someone managed to hit the paper at all. He'd never seen anything like what Sarah had just done. The hole in her target was perfectly centered, clean, and surrounded by the kind of precision scoring rings that separated expert shooters from everyone else. It was the kind of shot that seasoned competitors struggled to achieve under pressure, and Sarah had done it as casually as someone checking off an item on a grocery list. Sarah lowered the pistol, keeping it pointed downrange as Dale had instructed, and waited. Her expression remained neutral, almost bored, as if she'd expected exactly what had just happened. Around her, the normal rhythm of the shooting range had developed a strange hiccup as people noticed that something unusual was occurring at lane 7. "That's," Dale started, then stopped. He'd been about to say impossible, but the evidence was hanging right there in front of them. "That's a really good shot." Sarah turned slightly to look at him, and for just a moment Dale saw something in her eyes that made his stomach do a small flip. It wasn't pride or satisfaction or surprise. It was something that looked almost like pity, as if she felt sorry for him for not understanding what he was really looking at. "Thank you," she said quietly. "May I continue?" The question was polite, respectful, and completely reasonable. It was also somehow the most intimidating thing Dale had heard all morning. Marcus walked over from lane 3, his tactical boots crunching on the scattered brass casings that littered the range floor. His expensive shooting vest was loaded with spare magazines and accessories that proclaimed his serious commitment to the sport. He positioned himself where he could see both Sarah and her target, his expression cycling through confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been concern. "Nice shot," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You said this was your first time here, right?" Sarah nodded. "First time at this range, yes." The precision of her answer wasn't lost on Marcus. She hadn't said it was her first time shooting or her first time holding a gun, just her first time at this particular range. The distinction was subtle but significant, and Marcus caught it immediately. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Kevin asked, joining them. His Mullen-Labe shirt was damp with sweat despite the air conditioning, and his earlier swagger had evaporated. "YouTube," Sarah answered, loading another round into the chamber with movements that were becoming increasingly difficult to classify as beginner level. "There are some very good instructional videos available." It was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie that people wanted to believe, the kind that let them maintain their comfortable assumptions about who belonged in their world and who didn't, the kind that let them explain away what they were seeing without having to confront the possibility that their assumptions might be fundamentally wrong. Sarah raised the pistol again, and this time everyone was watching. The normal sounds of the range continued around them, other shooters pursuing their own practice, the ventilation system cycling air, the distant sound of someone's phone buzzing. But lanes 3 through 7 had become their own little universe. The second shot was as perfect as the first. Dead center, clean hole, no deviation from the point of aim. Sarah's stance remained steady throughout the shot cycle, absorbing the minimal recoil of the .22, with the kind of body mechanics that suggested deep familiarity with firearms. "Jesus," Tony whispered. The third shot expanded the hole slightly. The fourth and fifth shots went into the same ragged opening. By the sixth shot, even the other shooters on the range were starting to notice that something unusual was happening. Conversations were dying mid-sentence as people turned to see what was drawing everyone's attention. Sarah fired 10 rounds in a steady rhythm, each shot as precise as the last. When she was finished, her target showed a single, slightly elongated hole where the center ring used to be. At 7 yards, with a rental gun she'd never fired before, she had achieved the kind of accuracy that would have been impressive at 3 times the distance. She set the pistol down carefully, pointed downrange, and stepped back from the firing line. Her movements remained calm and controlled, but there was something different about her now. Some of the careful invisibility she'd worn like armor had started to slip away, revealing glimpses of someone else underneath. "That's some pretty impressive shooting," Marcus said carefully. "For someone who learned on YouTube." Sarah looked at him with those same dark eyes that had unsettled Dale. "Thank you," she said. "I'm a very good student." The lie was becoming harder to maintain, and everyone knew it. YouTube videos didn't teach the kind of muscle memory Sarah was displaying. Online tutorials didn't create the steady breathing and perfect trigger control she'd demonstrated. Most importantly, no amount of theoretical instruction could explain the complete absence of beginners' nerves, the lack of flinching, the natural comfort with the weapon that she couldn't quite hide. "What do you do for work?" Kevin asked, his tone suggesting the question was more important than casual conversation. "I'm a librarian," Sarah answered. "Children's section mostly. Story time on Tuesdays and Thursdays." The contrast was so stark, it felt surreal. The woman who had just put 10 rounds through the same hole worked with children and read picture books for a living. She wore cardigans and sensible shoes and probably had strong opinions about late fees and proper book care. Except that she also shot like someone who had been doing it since before she could drive. Dale cleared his throat. "Maybe we should move you back to 15 yards, he suggested. 7 yards is pretty close for someone with your, skill level." Sarah nodded agreeably. "That sounds appropriate." As Dale moved her target back, the small crowd around Sarah's lane grew larger. Word was spreading through the range that something worth watching was happening at lane 7. Shooters from other lanes found excuses to walk past, checking out the action while pretending to examine the ammunition selection or visit the water fountain. Among the gathering observers was a man who had been quietly practicing at lane 12 since before Sarah arrived. Unlike the others, He wasn't there for recreation or to prove anything. His name was Detective Ray Morrison, and he'd been shooting competitively for 15 years before joining the police force. He'd seen thousands of shooters during his career, from complete novices to Olympic-level competitors. What he was watching now made him very, very interested in learning more about the quiet woman in the cardigan. Sarah took her position at the 15-yard line with the same calm confidence she'd shown at 7 yards. The distance had more than doubled, which should have made precision shooting significantly more difficult. The target looked smaller, the margin for error had shrunk, and even experienced shooters sometimes struggled with the transition. Sarah raised the pistol, aligned her sights, and began firing her second magazine. The results were identical to the first. Perfect shot placement. No deviation, no sign that the increased distance had affected her accuracy in any way. Each round found the center of the target with mechanical precision, as if she were operating some kind of automated shooting device rather than relying on human skill and judgment. By the time she finished the second magazine, the normal operation of the shooting range had effectively stopped. Everyone was watching Lane 7, including the range safety officer who had emerged from his booth to see what was drawing so much attention. The silence between shots had become charged with tension and anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for Sarah to miss. She never missed. Detective Morrison stepped closer, his police instincts fully engaged now. He'd seen this kind of shooting before, but never from someone who claimed to be a librarian with YouTube training. This was military-level precision, the kind that came from intensive professional instruction and constant practice. This was the shooting of someone who had been trained to hit what they aimed at when missing wasn't an option. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came with 20 years of police work. "Could I ask you a question?" Sarah turned to look at him, and Morrison felt the same unsettling recognition that Dale and the others had experienced. Her eyes held depths that didn't match her carefully constructed appearance, suggestions of experiences that went far beyond story time and late fees. "Of course," Sarah said politely. "That's some extraordinary shooting," Morrison said. "Mind if I ask where you received your training?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the guns. Everyone within earshot turned to hear Sarah's answer, sensing that this moment would determine whether the morning's entertainment would continue or whether something much more serious was about to unfold. Sarah looked at Detective Morrison for a long moment, studying his face with the kind of attention that suggested she was seeing more than just a curious observer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of finality that hadn't been there before. "I think," she said carefully, "that might be a longer conversation than you're expecting." Detective Morrison's question created a moment of perfect silence on the shooting range. Even the ventilation system seemed to pause, waiting for Sarah's response. The small crowd that had gathered around Lane 7 stood frozen, sensing that whatever came next would be far more significant than watching a surprisingly skilled amateur put holes in paper targets. Sarah set the empty pistol down on the shooting bench, keeping it pointed down range with the unconscious precision of someone for whom gun safety had been drilled into muscle memory through endless repetition. She removed her safety glasses and ear protection, movements that somehow managed to be both casual and deliberate. "Detective Morrison," she said, reading his name from the badge clipped to his belt. 20-year veteran competitive shooter, probably wondering how someone who claims to have learned marksmanship from YouTube managed to outshoot half the range. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Most civilians didn't read law enforcement body language with that kind of accuracy. Most civilians didn't notice details like concealed badges or make such precise assessments about someone's experience level. "Something like that," he admitted. "Your shooting suggests a level of training that doesn't typically come from online videos." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if she'd been expecting this moment for a long time, and was finally relieved to have it arrive. Around them, the other shooters maintained their positions, but had stopped pretending to focus on their own practice. Marcus, Kevin, and Tony formed a loose semicircle, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity and something that might have been concern. "The truth is complicated," Sarah said finally, "and it's not particularly pleasant." She looked around at the faces watching her, seeing the mix of fascination and suspicion that her demonstration had created. These men had come to the range, expecting a normal morning of recreational shooting, perhaps with the added entertainment of watching a nervous beginner embarrass herself. Instead, they'd stumbled into something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about who they shared their hobby with. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," Sarah continued, "though I should warn you that knowing the truth tends to change how people look at me, and once I tell you, there's no going back to thinking I'm just a quiet librarian who got lucky." Dale shifted uncomfortably. Something in Sarah's tone suggested that her story wouldn't be the kind of heartwarming tale about overcoming challenges that people usually expected. This felt more like a confession, or possibly a warning. "My name is Sarah Chen," she began, "and I have been a children's librarian for the past 8 years. That part is true. I do read stories on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I do know entirely too much about picture book authors and proper shelving techniques. I make an excellent salary helping kids find books about dinosaurs and teaching elderly patrons how to use the computer catalog." She paused, looking down at her hands. They were small hands, soft from years of handling books rather than weapons, with neat fingernails and a simple wedding ring that had been purchased from a department store jewelry counter. "But before I was Sarah Chen, the librarian, I was Sergeant Sarah Kim, United States Army, Special Operations. I spent 6 years in places that officially don't exist, doing things that officially never happened, with weapons that were significantly more complex than what I've been shooting today." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the assembled group. Morrison's expression shifted from curiosity to sharp professional interest. Marcus took an involuntary step backward. Tony's mouth opened slightly, then closed again without producing any sound. "Sniper training," Sarah continued matter-of-factly. "Counter-terrorism operations, hostage rescue, the kind of work where missing your target means other people don't come home to their families. I was very good at my job, which is why I'm still alive to stand here and put .22 caliber holes exactly where I want them to go." Kevin, whose Molon Labe shirt had proclaimed his support for Second Amendment rights, found himself staring at a woman who had actually used those rights in ways he'd only fantasized about. The irony wasn't lost on him, and his face flushed with embarrassment at the memory of his earlier condescension. "Jesus Christ," Tony whispered. "You're military." "Was military," Sarah corrected. "Past tense, very past tense. I've been out for 15 years, which is longer than some of you have been adults. But certain skills don't fade even when you want them to." Detective Morrison stepped closer, his professional instincts fully engaged. "Special operations covers a lot of territory. What was your specific MOS?" Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd entered the range, but it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. "Military Occupational Specialty 11B40, infantry with additional schools for advanced marksmanship and close-quarters combat, though my actual assignments were considerably more specialized than that designation suggests." "How specialized?" Morrison pressed. "The kind that comes with non-disclosure agreements that never expire," Sarah replied. "The kind where your service record gets redacted and your discharge papers list you as having been stationed at bases that were decommissioned before you enlisted. The kind where old teammates occasionally disappear from public records entirely." The implications of what she was saying settled over the group like a heavy blanket. This wasn't someone who had served in a support role or spent her deployment processing paperwork in a safe rear area. Sarah was describing the kind of military service that existed in the shadows, the operations that generated no headlines and left no official trace. "Why are you telling us this?" Marcus asked. His expensive tactical gear suddenly felt like costume jewelry in the presence of someone who had worn the real thing in places where it had actually mattered. "Because," Sarah said, "you asked. And because I'm tired of pretending to be surprised by my own competence." "Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to spend 8 years acting like changing a light bulb is a complex mechanical challenge when you've disassembled and reassembled crew-served weapons blindfolded?" She gestured toward the targets downrange, where her perfect groups served as evidence of skills that most recreational shooters would never achieve. "I didn't come here to show off, or to embarrass anyone. I came here because I missed shooting, and I thought maybe I could fire a few rounds without anyone asking too many questions. I thought I could maybe dial back my accuracy to something that looked more like beginner's luck." "But you didn't," Dale observed. "No, I didn't." Sarah's voice carried a note of resignation. "I spent 6 years in situations where anything less than perfect accuracy meant people died. I spent another 9 years after that trying to be normal, trying to convince myself that I could be satisfied with a quiet life where the most dangerous thing I handled was an overdue notice." She looked around at the faces watching her, seeing the mixture of fascination and unease that her revelation had created. These men had come to the range as recreational shooters, hobbyists who enjoyed the technical challenge and the stress relief that came with punching holes in paper. Now they were confronted with someone for whom shooting had been a matter of survival rather than entertainment. "The thing about military training," Sarah continued, "is that it changes how you see the world. You notice things that other people miss: exit routes, sight lines, potential threats, people who move wrong or watch too carefully. You develop instincts that never fully go away, even when you're trying very hard to be normal." Morrison nodded, understanding. He'd worked with enough veterans to recognize the signs she was describing: the hypervigilance, the constant threat assessment, the way combat experience left invisible marks that shaped behavior years later. "PTSD?" he asked gently. Sarah shook her head. "No, nothing like that. I was lucky. I came home intact, psychologically speaking. But the skills remain. The muscle memory, the training, the ability to do things that normal people can't do. And sometimes, despite my best efforts to hide it, those skills surface." She gestured toward her target again, where 20 rounds had created a single ragged hole in the exact center of the scoring rings. "This is what surfacing looks like." Tony cleared his throat nervously. "So when you said you learned from YouTube..." "I lied," Sarah admitted without apology. "I learned from some of the best military instructors in the world, in training programs that cost the taxpayers several $100,000 per student. YouTube had nothing to do with it." The honesty of her admission was somehow more unsettling than the shooting demonstration had been. Sarah was revealing herself to be someone who had spent years carefully constructing a false identity, someone whose entire public persona was an elaborate performance designed to hide her true capabilities. "Why become a librarian?" Kevin asked. "I mean, if you had that kind of training, that kind of background, why not stay in law enforcement or private security or something?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of genuine emotion for the first time since her revelation had begun. "Because I wanted to read stories to children," she said simply. "Because I wanted to help people find books about gardening and cookie recipes and local history. Because I wanted to spend my days in a quiet place where the most violent thing that happened was an argument over late fees." She paused, looking down at her hands again. "Because I wanted to prove to myself that I could be someone other than what the military had made me. That I could build a life based on helping people learn and grow rather than other things." The weight of what she wasn't saying hung heavy in the air. Everyone present understood that other things covered territory that none of them wanted to explore too deeply. And it worked, Sarah continued. For 8 years it worked perfectly. I was Sarah Chen, the children's librarian, and nobody questioned whether someone with my background could really be content organizing book fairs and teaching computer classes to senior citizens. What changed? Morrison asked. Sarah looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience that went far beyond her apparent age. Nothing changed, she said. That's the problem. I thought I could leave that part of myself behind permanently. I thought I could become someone new and never look back. But you can't escape your own capabilities forever. Eventually, the person you really are demands recognition. She gestured around the shooting range, taking in the lanes full of recreational shooters who pursued marksmanship as a hobby rather than a profession. This is who I really am, she said, not the quiet librarian in sensible shoes. This is what 15 years of trying to be normal looks like when the facade finally cracks. The revelation hung in the air like cordite smoke, heavy and impossible to ignore. Around Lane 7, the normal sounds of the shooting range seemed muted, as if the building itself was processing what Sarah had revealed. The casual morning of recreational shooting had transformed into something entirely different, a moment of recognition that would reshape how everyone present understood the assumptions they made about the people around them. Detective Morrison was the first to break the silence. His 20 years of police work had taught him to read people, to distinguish between those who talked about violence and those who had actually lived it. Sarah's calm demeanor, her precise language, and the way she held herself all spoke to genuine experience rather than fantasy or exaggeration. Afghanistan? He asked quietly. Sarah nodded. 3 deployments. Iraq twice. Several other places that don't officially exist in military records. Morrison understood. He'd worked with enough veterans to know that some assignments remained classified long after the wars ended, that some soldiers carried secrets that would never appear in official histories. Thank you for your service, he said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. Sarah's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. Thank you. Though I should mention that my service wasn't particularly heroic. I did my job, I followed orders, and I was fortunate enough to come home alive. The real heroes are the ones whose names are engraved in black stone in Washington. The humility in her response only reinforced Morrison's assessment of her character. In his experience, the people who had actually done difficult things rarely bragged about them. It was the wannabes and posers who couldn't stop talking about their imaginary exploits. Marcus stepped forward, and his entire demeanor had changed. The swagger and condescension that had characterized his earlier behavior had been replaced by genuine respect. His expensive tactical gear, which had seemed so impressive an hour ago, now looked like what it actually was: recreational equipment purchased by someone who enjoyed the appearance of preparedness more than the reality of it. I owe you an apology, he said directly. What I said earlier, the betting, the comments about soccer moms, that was completely out of line. Sarah studied his face for a moment, seeing something there that suggested his apology was genuine rather than simply expedient. Apology accepted, she said, though I should point out that your assumption wasn't entirely wrong. I am technically a soccer mom. My daughter plays in the youth league on Saturdays. The image was so incongruous that it took a moment for everyone to process. The woman who had just demonstrated military-grade marksmanship skills spent her weekends cheering for 8-year-olds who were still learning which direction to kick the ball. That's... Tony started, then stopped, unable to find words for the disconnect between Sarah's apparent normalcy and her revealed capabilities. That's what normal looks like when you're trying very hard to be normal, Sarah explained. PTA meetings, parent-teacher conferences, arguments with other moms about snack schedules and carpool arrangements. I've become quite expert at discussing youth soccer strategies and the relative merits of different juice box brands. Kevin laughed nervously. That's probably the most surreal thing I've ever heard. Why? Sarah asked. Did you assume that people with military experience can't adapt to civilian life? That we're all damaged or dangerous or incapable of caring about mundane things like our children's athletic activities? Her question hung in the air, challenging assumptions that went deeper than just marksmanship ability. Kevin found himself confronting his own preconceptions about veterans, about women, about the kinds of people who belonged in his recreational shooting community. I guess I never thought about it, he admitted. Most people don't, Sarah said, and that's generally been fine with me. I've spent 8 years flying under the radar, being exactly what people expected me to be. The helpful librarian who knows where to find everything, who can recommend the perfect book for any reading level, who organizes community events and helps elderly patrons navigate technology they don't understand. She paused, looking around at the group that had formed around her lane. But there's something exhausting about hiding your competence, about pretending that complex tasks are mysterious when you've done far more difficult things, about acting grateful for basic instruction when you could probably teach the class yourself. Dale shifted uncomfortably. He'd spent the morning patronizing someone who knew more about firearms than he'd learned in 5 years of range work. The memory of his condescending safety lecture made his cheeks burn with embarrassment. The instruction you gave me was perfectly adequate, Sarah said, noticing his discomfort. And it was appropriate for someone you believed to be a complete beginner. You had no reason to assume otherwise. But you didn't correct me, Dale said. You let me explain things you already knew. Sarah smiled, and this time the expression held genuine warmth. Dale, in my experience, people who insist on demonstrating their expertise the moment they walk into a new environment tend to make everyone uncomfortable. I was trying to fit in, not show off. Until the shooting started, Morrison observed. Until the shooting started, Sarah agreed. That's where my carefully constructed normal persona tends to break down. Some skills are too deeply ingrained to fake incompetence convincingly. A new voice joined the conversation from behind the group. Ma'am, if I could interrupt for a moment. Everyone turned to see an older man in his 60s approaching from lane 12. His bearing and the way he moved suggested military experience, though his civilian clothes gave no immediate indication of his background. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke to years spent outdoors, and his eyes held the particular alertness that came from careers spent in dangerous professions. Colonel Peterson, retired, he introduced himself. I couldn't help but observe your shooting, and I have to say, that's some of the finest marksmanship I've seen outside of military competition. Sarah's posture shifted slightly as she recognized the approach of someone who shared her background. Thank you, sir. What was your unit? 75th Ranger Regiment back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, Peterson replied with a slight grin. Before your time, I'm sure. But I recognize quality shooting when I see it. The exchange between Sarah and Peterson carried undertones that the recreational shooters couldn't fully decode, but Morrison caught the significance. These were two professionals recognizing each other across the gap of years and different service branches. Where did you train? Peterson asked. Benning for basic marksmanship, then advanced schools that I probably shouldn't name in present company, Sarah replied carefully. Peterson nodded, understanding. The good schools. The ones that turn out shooters who don't miss when it matters. Something like that. The colonel looked around at the assembled group, taking in their expressions of fascination and lingering confusion. Gentlemen, what you witnessed this morning isn't just good shooting. It's combat-level precision maintained 15 years after discharge. That takes dedication that goes far beyond recreational practice. His assessment carried the weight of professional judgment, and it helped the others understand just how extraordinary Sarah's demonstration had been. This wasn't someone who had gotten lucky with a few good shots. This was someone maintaining elite-level skills through sheer force of will and muscle memory. "Have you been practicing regularly?" Peterson asked Sarah. She shook her head. "Not for years. I stopped visiting ranges about 5 years ago because it was becoming too difficult to dial back my accuracy to levels that wouldn't attract attention." "And yet you haven't lost it," Peterson observed. "Apparently not." The colonel's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, there are competitive shooting sports that would welcome someone with your abilities. Nothing that would compromise your operational security, but venues where you could shoot to your actual capability without having to pretend to be someone you're not." Sarah considered this. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of visibility." "Think about it," Peterson said. "It might be healthier than suppressing your abilities indefinitely." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the range safety officer, a heavy-set man whose shirt identified him as the facility manager. He'd been monitoring the situation from his booth, and the crowd gathering around Lane 7 had finally prompted him to investigate personally. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was prepared to deal with whatever drama might be unfolding. "Everything's fine, Chuck," Morrison assured him. "Just some impressive shooting that got everyone's attention." Chuck looked at Sarah's target, still hanging at 15 yards with its single large hole where the center ring used to be. His eyebrows rose slightly as he took in the precision of the grouping. "First time shooting?" he asked Sarah. "First time at this range," she corrected. Chuck had been managing shooting ranges for 20 years, and he'd developed an eye for different types of shooters. Recreational enthusiasts, competitive marksmen, law enforcement officers, military personnel. Each group had its own characteristics and capabilities. Sarah's shooting fell into a category that he rarely saw outside of very specific circumstances. "Military?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Special operations?" Another nod. Chuck's expression shifted to one of professional respect. "Well, that explains that. Carry on, then. Just keep it safe." As Chuck returned to his booth, the group around Sarah began to disperse slightly. The initial shock of her revelation was wearing off, replaced by a kind of settled acceptance of what they'd learned. The morning's entertainment was over, but something more significant had taken its place. A shared understanding that their assumptions about people had been fundamentally challenged. Marcus packed up his equipment thoughtfully. His expensive gear no longer seemed quite as important as it had when he'd arrived. The precision of his earlier shooting, which had impressed him so much, now looked merely adequate in the context of what real expertise looked like. "Thank you for the education," he said to Sarah as he prepared to leave. "Thank you for being decent about it," she replied. "Not everyone would have handled the surprise as well as you did." Kevin and Tony gathered their gear as well, both of them clearly processing the morning's revelations. Their earlier mockery seemed like ancient history, replaced by a grudging respect for someone who had demonstrated capabilities they couldn't hope to match. As the crowd thinned, Sarah found herself alone with Detective Morrison and Colonel Peterson. The three of them represented different aspects of public service: law enforcement, military, and civilian education, but they shared something that the recreational shooters didn't fully understand. "What now?" Morrison asked. Sarah looked down at the pistol she'd been using, still lying on the shooting bench where she'd placed it after her demonstration. For 2 hours, she'd been more herself than she'd been in 8 years. The question was whether she could go back to being the quiet librarian, or whether that carefully constructed identity had been permanently compromised. "Now," she said finally, "I suppose I figure out who Sarah Chen is going to be tomorrow." 3 weeks after the morning that would become legend at Blackwater Tactical Range, Sarah Chen sat in her usual spot behind the children's library circulation desk, helping a 7-year-old named Emma find books about horses. It was Tuesday afternoon, which meant story time was approaching. and she could see parents beginning to gather in the children's area with toddlers and preschoolers in tow. "This one has really pretty pictures," Emma said, holding up a book about wild mustangs. "That's an excellent choice," Sarah replied, scanning the barcode with the same attention to detail she brought to everything she did. "The author spent 2 years photographing horses in the American West. The photographs are real, not drawings." Emma's eyes widened with delight. "Real horses?" "Real horses," Sarah confirmed, smiling at the girl's enthusiasm. "Some of them are over 100 years old. The photographs, not the horses." As Emma skipped away with her treasure, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came from connecting a curious mind with exactly the right information. This part of her life hadn't changed. She still loved her work, still found genuine fulfillment in helping people discover new worlds through books. But other things had changed significantly since that morning at the shooting range. The first change had come that very afternoon, when she'd returned home to find her husband David waiting with questions about why the range safety officer had called their house to verify her emergency contact information. The conversation that followed had been the most honest discussion they'd had in years. David had listened in stunned silence as Sarah explained about her military background, her specialized training, and the reasons she'd never discussed her service in detail. He'd married a quiet librarian with a mysterious past, but he'd never imagined that the mystery included elite military training and classified operations. "You were a sniper?" he'd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Among other things," Sarah had replied. "It's not the kind of experience that comes up naturally in conversation." The adjustment period had been difficult. David had needed time to reconcile the woman he'd married with the soldier she'd once been. But ultimately, his love for her had proven stronger than his surprise at her revelations. If anything, understanding her background had helped explain certain quirks he'd noticed over the years. Her alertness in public spaces, her insistence on sitting with her back to walls in restaurants, her uncanny ability to assess people and situations. The second change had come from an unexpected source, Colonel Peterson. True to his word, the retired officer had researched competitive shooting opportunities that might interest someone with Sarah's background. A week after their meeting, he'd contacted her with information about a civilian marksmanship program that welcomed former military personnel and focused on precision shooting rather than tactical applications. "It's not about reliving your service," he'd explained during their phone conversation. "It's about giving you a place where you can be excellent without having to hide it." Sarah had resisted initially. 8 years of carefully constructed normalcy weren't easily abandoned, and the idea of deliberately drawing attention to her abilities felt dangerous. But David had surprised her by encouraging her to explore the opportunity. "You've spent our entire marriage holding back," he'd said. "Maybe it's time to see what happens when you don't." The third change had been the most unexpected. Her reputation at the library. Word of her shooting demonstration had somehow made its way through the local community, not the classified details of her military service, but the general fact that the quiet children's librarian had surprised everyone at the shooting range. Rather than viewing this as scandalous or inappropriate, her colleagues and patrons had reacted with fascination and respect. The head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had approached Sarah the following Monday with a request that caught her completely off guard. "The police department has been asking about developing a community safety program," Mrs. Patterson had said. "Educational presentations about personal safety, situational awareness, that sort of thing. Given your background, would you be interested in helping develop the curriculum?" It was the first time in 8 years that someone had asked Sarah to contribute her military experience to a civilian project. The idea that her specialized knowledge could be valuable in a non-combat context had never occurred to her. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of teaching," Sarah had replied. "You're qualified for whatever you choose to be qualified for," Mrs. Patterson had said firmly. The question is whether you're interested. Now, 3 weeks later, Sarah was discovering that the answer was yes. The Community Safety Program had launched the previous Saturday with a presentation about situational awareness for parents. Sarah had found herself standing in front of 30 adults, explaining how to identify potential threats, recognize unusual behavior, and position themselves advantageously in public spaces. The skills that had once kept her alive in hostile territory translated surprisingly well to helping soccer parents navigate parking lots and shopping centers. The response had been overwhelmingly positive. Parents wanted to learn more about keeping their families safe, and Sarah discovered that she enjoyed teaching these skills in a constructive context. For the first time since leaving the military, she was using her specialized knowledge to help rather than hide. "Ms. Sarah?" A small voice interrupted her thoughts. "Is it story time yet?" Sarah looked down to see Tommy, a 4-year-old regular who attended every Tuesday session with religious devotion. Behind him, the children's area was filling with small faces and expectant parents. "It certainly is," Sarah said, standing and straightening her cardigan. Some things, thankfully, remained exactly the same. The story she'd chosen for today was about a little engine that thought it couldn't climb a big hill, but discovered that it was stronger than it had believed. The irony wasn't lost on her as she read about overcoming self-imposed limitations and discovering hidden capabilities. After story time, as parents collected their children and headed home for dinner, Sarah was approached by a woman she'd seen at several previous sessions. "Ms. Chen," the woman said tentatively, "I heard about the safety program you're developing. My husband mentioned that you have some kind of military background." Sarah nodded carefully. "I do. Is that relevant to something?" "Well, I was wondering, would you ever consider doing a program specifically for women, about self-defense, or just feeling more confident in general? A lot of us feel pretty helpless when it comes to physical safety." The request represented yet another way her hidden skills might serve her community. Sarah had trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat and close-quarters defense, knowledge that could potentially help women feel more confident and secure in their daily lives. "That's an interesting idea," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Let me think about how that might work." As the library emptied and Sarah prepared to close the children's section for the day, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning at the shooting range. The carefully constructed walls between her military past and civilian present had crumbled. But instead of disaster, she'd found opportunity. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Morrison. "Range time this Saturday. Colonel Peterson wants to introduce you to the competitive shooting club." Sarah considered the invitation. 3 weeks ago, she would have declined automatically, too committed to her facade of normalcy to risk further exposure. Now the prospect seemed not just acceptable, but genuinely appealing. She typed back, "What time?" The response came immediately. 0900. Come prepared to shoot to your actual ability level. Sarah smiled as she gathered her belongings and prepared to head home. For 15 years, she'd been living as a diminished version of herself, suppressing capabilities that defined who she really was. The morning at Blackwater had forced her to confront the unsustainability of that approach. She was still Sarah Chen, children's librarian. She still loved reading stories to kids and helping patrons find information about local history and cookie recipes. But she was also someone else. Someone with skills and experiences that could contribute to her community in ways she'd never imagined. As she locked the library doors behind her, Sarah thought about the conversation she'd had with David the night before. He'd asked whether she missed her military service, whether civilian life felt too small after the intensity of special operations. "I don't miss the violence," she'd told him. "I don't miss the danger or the stress or the constant awareness that people were trying to kill me. But I do miss being excellent at something that mattered. I miss using my capabilities fully rather than hiding them." "And now?" David had asked. Now I'm starting to think there might be ways to be excellent that don't require hiding. Walking to her car in the library parking lot, Sarah felt the familiar awareness of her surroundings that had never fully faded. Exit routes, potential threats, strategic positions. Her mind cataloged them automatically, just as it had for 23 years. But for the first time in nearly a decade, she wasn't fighting those instincts or trying to suppress them. She was accepting them as part of who she was. Saturday morning would bring another session at the shooting range, this time without pretense or false modesty. She would shoot to her actual ability level and let the results speak for themselves. The competitive shooting club that Colonel Peterson had mentioned might offer a place where excellence was expected rather than hidden. The community safety programs were generating interest that might lead to expanded offerings, women's self-defense, advanced situational awareness, perhaps even consulting with local law enforcement on specialized training issues. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah could envision a future where her unique skills were valued rather than concealed. Her phone buzzed with another text, this one from Emma's mother. Emma hasn't stopped talking about the Mustang book. Thank you for knowing exactly what she needed. Sarah smiled as she started her car. Some forms of excellence were quiet and went unnoticed by everyone except those who benefited from them. Others were dramatic and impossible to ignore. She was learning that there might be room in her life for both. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a woman hiding from her own capabilities. Tonight, she was someone discovering that authenticity might be less dangerous than she'd believed. Tomorrow, she would continue figuring out who Sarah Chen could become when she stopped pretending to be less than she actually was. The quiet woman at the tactical range had found her voice, and everyone who heard it would remember the sound forever.